India, until the early 1990s, was a fairly closed economy. In other words, it wasn't open to the winds of international trade. Tariffs were very high. Government spending, there was a great deal of the role of the state in agriculture and in food. And after, the beginning of the 1990s, this all changed. The man who is now Prime Minister of India was then the Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh, and he had a vision of neoliberal policies raising up India. And so he reduced the amount of money that was going to be spent in rural areas. He cut back on the amount of money that was going to be given to farmers and invested in farmers. He cut back on the amount of money that would be spent on on urban food programs and entitlement programs, and opened up the economy to any foreign investor or any foreign corporation that wanted to come in. And this had some fairly disastrous consequences. India is one of the homes of incredibly high rates of farmer suicide. And you see those rates increasing. The stories of farmer suicide that you hear in India aren't particularly Indian. I mean, they're always stories that have the same kind of background. They're stories about how a farmer wants to improve the land so that they can leave it, and it's usually he, can leave something better to his kids. And so he'll borrow money from the only place he can, the local money lender, and the local money lender charges interest at the rate of doubling the amount you have to repay every month. It's an incredibly high rate of interest, but the farmer takes the money because there's no other choice, and this is there's a firm belief that everything's going to turn out okay. So you borrow the money and you drill for you try and irrigate your land, for example, and there's no water, and so now you find yourself in deep debt. And what do? You borrow again to be able to double down on this bet, and you drill, and again there's no water, and so now you're deep in debt and you don't know what to do. And in India, at least in some of the families I visited, there were people waited until these men waited until the wife and kids went to bed, and then they pull down a packet of pesticide that is Forate, for example, is a pesticide that's not sold in the United States because it's illegal, but it's sold by US corporations in India. And one of the farmers I talked to mixed it with water and drank it, and he can't have convulsed very hard because he died without waking his wife and 2 kids over a sum of money that was $325 US. Now that's that kind of story is one that's told over and over again in India, but actually it's not a terribly Indian story. It's one that you can find told in the United Kingdom. You can find it told in Australia, and of course you can find it told here in the United States, in the Midwest, in the 1980s. When farmers who were on the verge of bankruptcy, who'd mortgaged the land, who were deep in debt, faced the threat, as farmers around the world do, of losing the land that had been in their families for generations. And so, rather than choose to lose the land that had been, that had defined their family, they chose to take their own lives. Leaving families struggling incredibly hard to cope. Now, that story is one that's true of India. It's also true that levels of hunger for India's poorest have been rising until they protested and demanded change, and actually recently won that. And we can talk about that in questions if people are interested. But India is also home to, very recently, India's richest men, they're all men, appeared in the Forbes billionaires list. In fact, 4 of the top 10 richest men in the world a couple of years back were Indian, more than any other country, because they'd been able to take advantage of all this money going into the country once it had been opened up. And India was also home, and it is now home, to the world's largest number of people with type 2 diabetes. And in a sense, I could have told them this for nothing. I mean, I'm British Asian, so my family has been struggling with what passes for the Western diet for a while, and so we've been exposed to it, and now there isn't a man in my family who's over 50 who isn't pricking his finger and checking his glucose in honor of the Western diet. Every British Asian family that I know struggles with blindness associated with diabetes, with cardiovascular disease, with amputation, and of course premature death. And this is starting to be, in Britain, by the way, the rates of diabetes among British Asians is about 20%. But in India, in rural areas, it's like 3%. But in the slums, it's 13%. In most Indian cities now, it's 14% and climbing. And this is in part because of changes in diet due to the influx of these of companies selling salt and fat and sugar. India, until the 1990s, didn't have Coke or Pepsi. India had a local brew called Thumbs Up. Has anyone here tried Thumbs Up? Click A on your thing. No. Is anyone? I don't know. Anyway, no, Thumbs Up. It's terrific. It tastes nothing like anything you've tried before, but it's lovely. It's beetle nutty. But all of a sudden, Coke and Pepsi come in. And Coke come in with their global Coke advert. The polar bear. Do you remember this polar bear advert? The polar bear, the sort of polar bears waddle along and they find Coke and then they lop the top of the bottle of Coke off, and there's no opposable thumbs, but they do it anyway. And they glug and they drink, and they look up at the northern lights. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Indian cultural iconography, but polar bears are not big in India. The northern lights, people know. So there are a billion people watching this on television going, what the fuck's that? Pepsi, on the other hand, nailed it. They hired the Bollywood A-list to tell, to sing and dance about how amazing Pepsi was. And so it was, Pepsi, Pepsi, Pepsi.